Hello and welcome to another training video. Now this video is going to be a bit unusual because it's not actually something that I know about. It's something I'm making assumptions about, mostly based on experimentation and experience. Now we're going to be talking about Excel, and what I'd like to look at is how the machine is storing the data for each of the cells within the workbook. Now the first thing to understand is a workbook contains multiple sheets. We can contain as many sheets as we like up to the limit of the memory of the machine we're working on. Now every single one of those sheets actually contains 16,000 and something columns and 1,000,000 and something rows. So if I select everything on the sheet, actually what I've done is I've selected 17 billion different cells. Now if you think about 17 billion, it's a very, very big number. And if we had to store the content of every single one of those cells, even if the content were nothing, it would take a huge amount of memory allocated to do so. So Excel doesn't do that. All Excel does is it records the cells that you have used. So it has a start point, which is always A1, and then it has an end point, which is the last used cell within the worksheet. So if I have used that cell, and let's say that cell has got something in it, and that cell there has got something in it, the last used cell is in fact my last used row and last used column. So D9, even though D9 hasn't actually been used, that is considered to be my last used cell. So what it's doing is it's shrinking down the sheet size to suit the size, the rectangular size of my range of used data. And this is much, much more efficient than actually selecting and storing the whole sheet every time. So let me close this book down. Not save it. I'm going to make a brand new workbook, and we're going to have a look at some other things about the cells within the sheet. Now the first thing to note is that at the moment every single cell is unused. So until I've done something in the workbook, I can't go in and do things like finding the blank cells, because actually if I say find blank cells, it will say that none of them are blank, even though actually all of them are blank. What it's actually telling me is that within my used cell range, none of the cells are blank. And that's useful to understand, is that Excel is doing all of its calculations, all of its editing, all of its things like, for example, clearing on the used range that is stored within me working with Excel. Now, there are a couple of other things to note about that, and one of them is that sometimes a used range is dynamic. So if I use a cell here and then delete what's in that cell is still recorded as being a used cell. So if I do Control Home and then Control End, you can see it takes me to that used cell. Now the reason I think that is done is because the cell still has some undo steps on it. So the fact of me deleting the text from there is still something that I can undo, and therefore that cell remains a used cell within this instance of me working with Excel. And I'll show you what I mean by that in a minute. Now let's have a look at some other things. Every cell at the moment is still empty. However, it has a null value, so it's not actually technically empty. And what I mean by that is, if I refer to a cell which is empty or null with a mathematical operation, then it will return a mathematical null value, which is 0. If I refer to it with a text function, it will return a text null value, which is an empty text string. Now, let's see what I mean by that. Actually, what I mean by that is this cell here, A1, if I refer to it from B1 and I say B1 equals the cell on its left, it returns a 0, because that's considered a mathematical function. Now, this cell here, if I were to say it equals that one and itself again, that is now not a 0. That is now a null text string. So the concatenate function is for joining text values together, and so joining that with itself doesn't return 0 plus 0, it returns null and null, so nothing and nothing, which actually is nothing. Now, of course, these cells are no longer blank. Even though they may look blank, they are no longer blank, they contain null values. And to demonstrate that, if I do my find and select, go to special blanks, they are not blank. They actually have something in them, even though the things they are referring to are still considered blank. Okay, so at the moment, my used range of data is including E10. Now, the reason it includes E10 is because that's where I wrote my name initially, even though it no longer has my name in there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to close and save this file. So I do Control W to close, and in fact I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to do F12 to save, and I'll put it on my desktop and I'll call it cells. Now I'll close it with Control W. Now I'm going to open that same file again, and immediately I'm going to do Control Shift End, and you'll notice it no longer selects the cells which, although I had used them before, they're no longer used in this instance because I no longer have the undo steps available. So the undo steps were actually what was storing the fact of me using those cells rather than the things that I had visible on my screen. Okay, well, that's a weird bit of a technical video so far, but why would we care? Why would we even need to use this? Well, let's imagine we had some numbers, and here we actually had null text string. Well, actually, if I select all of those numbers, I can see that the average is 3.4. Now, the reason is because although I have 6 cells selected, only 5 of them are numeric values. The 6th one is a null text string. Now, why is that relevant? Well, because actually, if I change that to a nothing, so I've deleted what's in that cell, it will still give me the same answer. So it will still say 3.4 as the average, but this time it's only actually considering 5 cells to be selected, because that one there is now an empty cell or a blank, rather than a null text or null numeric value. Now, even if I take this cell and I refer to another cell which I know to be empty or blank, because I've referred to it with a mathematical operation, this is now no longer blank. So now it gives me a different average because it's counting 6 cells and all 6 of them are considered to have a number in them. So that's where we would use it. We would use it where we're working out averages. Now, in particular, what you might do is you might have an if formula, and you might say if somebody's sales have exceeded a target, for example, then you might work out a commission based on the amount they've exceeded the target by. But if they haven't exceeded the target, rather than returning a 0 value as the value of false for the if statement, you might want it to return a null text string, so that when your boss asks you for the average of commission, rather than doing the math on all of the values of all of your employees, it actually only does it on the values of those who got commission, rather than on all of the values. So it will give you a different mathematical answer. So that's where you might use this. Understanding it is one thing. It's a nice to know. It's very useful to understand that actually Excel is not storing every single cell's values, and even if you do things like that and then apply conditional formatting, you're actually only applying the conditional formatting to all of the used cells, because whenever you select that, you've actually not selected 17 billion cells. You've actually only selected all the cells within your used range, which might then change depending on the function you do. Okay, I hope you have found this useful. If you have, don't forget to like and subscribe down below. And once more, thank you for listening.